5 years of schools and not doing that, not on anybody's payroll. I think I'm gonna send out free range. And she said, well, that's what I was thinking too. Because that's what we are. We've not been voted in anywhere or voted out yet. And so we just get up and go as the day guides. Of course, as I was planning for this morning to get here, you know, when you plan something like this, you schedule your time and everything, and then the cows get out. And so I've been out chasing cows this morning, and cows remind me a lot of church members. You know, they can find this real small hole and get out. And then you're trying to punch them back and encourage them to go back the way they came, and they look at that hole and say, that's too small, I can't get back in. And you have to run them around the 40 acres, and finally they find a place and get back in. So I was out chasing cows this morning in the cool time, but you know, it gives you time to do what? It gives you time to pray. When you walk around chasing cows, and you don't run, you gotta walk them. But as I look out and think about this, I guess Brother Lloyd is the only one here that's been coming to this fellowship longer than me. I've even been coming more than Nancy because she used to teach and couldn't come out. Then finally when they changed churches and all, she started coming, playing piano for us. My wife did a good job this morning. She never played the piano until after we were married. She never took a lesson until after we were married, and she started taking piano lessons and advanced through, and now does a good job, and she plays the piano different places as we go out. But I started coming here in about 69 or 70 spasmodically, and then in 74 I started coming on a regular basis, and I don't guess I've missed more than this many times since 1974. Even when I was working at school, I would slip away and come over here, and then go right back, and they never miss me. And so I've been coming to it a long time. And things have changed over the years. Our churches have changed to the point that churches that have the same name, same title, like Independent Baptist, they don't even get along now because they're divided over music, they're divided over Bible verses, they're divided over missionaries, divided over the way to do the Lord's table. I mean, even Independent, Fundamental, Premillennial, bless God, we ain't got no Sunday school literature churches, can't even get along. And then you add to that, since this fellowship has been going on, you think of the seminaries and Bible colleges that have changed. BJ has changed drastically to the point that fellows back in the day would not go to BJ now. Piedmont has changed so much that folks won't go there, they won't send their kids, so they send them to Liberty. I haven't figured that out yet. And if you know anything about Liberty, it's not the standard for conservatism and premillennialism. So those schools, we used to draw the professors and presidents of those organizations, and we used to have missionary presidents and representatives coming in. Yeah. But everything has changed so much, you can't even get them. They're all hiding under a rock somewhere. And then you add to that, we have social media. The average young buck out there pastoring a church, before he gets out of bed, before his feet hits the floor, he's been on social media and talked to 10 people already this morning. And he doesn't need this. He don't need somebody to preach to him and tell him what to do, because he has it all. And if you can't figure out, he pulls out his smartphone, and the smartphone tells him what to do. You know, and so times have really changed.
They sure have.
And you remember, brother, and a lot of the older brethren have died too. And the emphasis used to be premillennialism, because there was a strong amillennialism push back in the day from the Southern Baptists, and the Independent boys said that's not right. We need to encourage premillennialism. Well, when's the last time you heard a sermon on premillennialism? When's the last time you preached on premillennialism?
I did.
Yeah, I heard one Sunday. Howard Wilbur preached Sunday morning on the rapture of the church, and that's premillennialism. You don't hear that much these days. And so everything's changed. Our brother Howard Talley used to say, methods are many and principles are few. Methods may change, but principles never do. And if you don't change the method, you'll be out standing alone by yourself. You have to be careful. You know, when you build houses, Brother Lloyd's a builder, he knows this, and Calvin's laid a lot of cinder block in his day. The method of building has changed. The building codes have changed. You cannot get by today with what you could get by 50 years ago. And you have to adapt and you have to change or you won't build. And we feel we've been preached to so much that we are non-compromisers that we won't change anything. You know. See me? Look, see how I'm dressed today? You didn't say a thing about it. I thought sure he would say, look, he's got a towel today. You thought, well, you know the old saying, when in Rome,
you do.
No, dress like a priest. So that's what I'm doing. I'm dressing like a priest today when in Rome. So things change, and it's okay. God changes as you change. And your ministry and outreach changes as you physically change. You're not staying out as late now as you could. Now, Brother Michael here does. He's still a young man, and Jeff is. They're out all hours of the night visiting, knocking on doors, holding meetings, and stuff like that. But the rest of us, man, we got to tuck it in about 9 o'clock. I mean, 4 o'clock in the morning comes early, doesn't it? It does. I mean, I don't get up at 4, but it still comes early. And so, you have to change. And society changes. COVID made us change.
Yes.
We didn't like it. We fought and kicked and screamed. And a lot of my brothers made it a political situation. But I took high school biology and high school chemistry. I understand viruses. There's no politics for a virus. They're key. And I have respect for it. I don't care what the politics say. And so it made us change. And so we have to be adaptable and change. And God's changed our lives. We're doing things I never thought we'd do. We don't go Sunday night because we live so far out to get back. It takes an hour and a half round trip. And so we go to 2 or 3 churches in the morning. So we'll do one church here, and then we catch another church at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we spend our daylight hours on Sunday going to churches and speaking. I spoke over here in different places, but we don't go Sunday night. And at first I felt guilty about it. Now I don't feel guilty about it all now. I'm calloused, I guess. But you got to change. And that's what life's all about. Well, let's look at some people who changed. And I'm in Nehemiah chapter number 1. And that's enough meddling and sermonizing. And I have really changed. I have. I really. I was at church a while back and introduced to speak, and the guy introduced me as if I was 50 years ago, and brought tears to my eyes. And I said, brother, I'm not that fellow anymore. Ministry's changed, and things are different. In Nehemiah 1, it says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of, what's that word?
Hakaliah.
In today's world, everybody's naming their kids after Bible people. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that we have Noah's, and we have Caleb's, and we have Micah's, and we have Isaiah's, and we have Matthew's? Here's a name that nobody's used. You got your grandchild coming along, name him Hakaliah. Nobody's used that. And then it came in the month of Chislew. Now Chislew is the Hebrew month that corresponds with late November, early December. So it's what time? It's winter time. So, and it was in the 20th year. Where was it? I was in Shushan or Susa. That word means lily, the city of the lilies. And it was in the palace. And it's the winter quarters of the Persian king. And Nehemiah was there. Well, in verse 2, Hananiah, one of my brethren, came, and certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of captivity, concerning Jerusalem. And they said, The remnant that are left of captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And when I heard these words, I sat down. I just couldn't move. I was, we might say the word petrified. My mouth dropped open in despair. And I wept. And then notice it adds the phrase, and mourn. So he just didn't shed a few tears. And these were not crocodile tears to get pity. He genuinely wept and mourned. And he fasted and he prayed before the gods of heaven. So here we are in the book of Nehemiah. Now in the Hebrew writings, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. It was first Ezra and second Ezra. And then about 250 years after the life of Christ, a guy named Origen, who was an Egyptian, and he was a scholarly man. He was kind of off the rails a little bit. He was big into allegorical interpretations and stuff like that. But he separated these because he saw that in Ezra, you have the writings in the first person. You know what that means, first person, I, Ezra, Ezra, Ezra. And then in Nehemiah, you have Nehemiah written in part of it in the first person as well. So he concluded that there were two different authors, Ezra and Nehemiah, they should be separated. And then about, 400 AD, something like that, 300 something, a guy named Jerome, what did he write? He wrote the Vulgate. Vulgate means vulgar, not vulgar in today's sense, but meaning ordinary. He wanted to put the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and the Septuagint that had been put together years before in the Greek language, he wanted to put that in the language of the Roman people. And so he translated the Latin Vulgate. He printed that and kept it separate, and from then on, they've been two different books. And this is a story here in Nehemiah of the people who were in captivity. Now, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You know about the fall of Jerusalem because of the Babylonian captivity, and preceding that was the fall of the northern kingdoms by the Assyrians, and so they were carried away into captivity. And you know then that the Babylonians fell to the Persians, and the Persians then treated the Jewish people a little nicer than the preceding rulers. And so they allowed them certain freedoms and things like that. So in Ezra records the return of some of the Jews back to Jerusalem. Two waves in Ezra. The first wave under this guy named Zerubbabel, and then the latter half under Ezra, and they rebuilt the temple. Then the third wave comes about 15 years later. Nehemiah is about 15 years after Ezra, and he records the return to build the walls. Now, this is a parenthesis, has nothing to do with the sermon, but I encourage you to study. What percentage of those in captivity returned to Jerusalem?
39,897.
2%. That's the recorded there of that group he counted. The other groups counted, yes. 2%. About 2%. 98% were so comfortable in living in the world that they didn't come back. 98%. Now, if that doesn't encourage you this morning, nothing will. You're in a good family when you're in the 2%. Yeah, you're in 2%. We drink 2% milk, and that's better than whole milk anything. Okay, 2%. And so they settled. Now, watch this. When the wise men came out of the east, they came out of the land probably of Persia with modern-day Iran. Maybe Iraq. And you study today about the writings of modern people, and they write that these were religious people, probably Zoroastrian people, pagan worshipers who saw that star and came. I don't believe that for a minute. Not for 1 minute would God reveal that he has sent his son, and he's birthed in this place called Bethlehem, and I want you to go see him and worship him. Not in 1 minute would he tell a bunch of pagan people that and overlook his own people. I believe that the wise men were remnants of the 98% who didn't go back to Jerusalem. They had the writings, they had the book of Daniel, the book of Jeremiah, they had the Old Testament prophecies, they studied, they looked, they worked, and they were content. And did you know that the Jewish population is still in Iran? Several thousand in Iran. Now in Iraq, it's down to about, I just read yesterday, five Jews left in Iraq. All of them left. But there's huge cities abandoned and synagogues abandoned. Those folks settled down, they didn't go back. And when Nehemiah saw that, when he saw that these people did not want to go back and that the walls were torn down, it crushed his very soul. And he sat down and he wept. Now if you do some research on the book of Nehemiah, there's 101 books on Nehemiah about his leadership. That's all I'm just about basically about. The leadership style of Nehemiah. How to motivate your church. How to encourage people to do what they really don't want to do. How to get your deacons to follow when they're going in a different direction. But very little about the prayers of Nehemiah. There's probably more praying in the book of Nehemiah than any other book. Some say that there's at least 15 prayers, and there's prayers within prayers. So it's kind of like the miracles of Jesus. Every book has a different number of miracles, because some miracles are within different miracles. It depends on how you count them. So there's a lot of praying. And the longest prayer right here is in chapter 1, and it becomes a pattern not only for us, but of all of the praying in the book of Nehemiah. And it's an encouragement of God's people just to be people of prayer. I think it was here I said a while back, preaching here one Sunday morning, that it ought to be a rule that we cannot sing Sweet Hour of Prayer until everybody signs a statement, I have just concluded praying for 1 hour. We need to change it to a minute of prayer. Sweet minute of prayer, a moment is gone. But here we find a long, lengthy prayer. And this prayer becomes instructive for us, instructive for me. And in verse number 4, when he heard these words, he sat down and prayed. What does that teach you? What do you get from that verse? Tell me, talk back to me. What lesson is, when I heard these words, I sat down and prayed?
Talk to the Lord.
Say again?
Talk to the Lord.
You wanted to talk to the Lord?
He took ownership.
I'm sorry?
He took ownership.
He took ownership of that situation, yeah. Sometimes God has to get our attention before we pray. Do you think God had Nehemiah's attention right then?
No.
Now, here's another footnote. Nehemiah's elevation to the courtyard of the king. He was the king's cupbearer. And in the day, it not only meant that he tasted the food and the drink, but he talked to the king. And historians will tell you that the kings would carry on conversations because they wanted to stay on the good side of the cupbearer. The cupbearer could kill him, taste it, and then hand him another drink. And so he was on the inside track with the king. And so he really had it made. He was taken care of. He had the finest of foods, finest of clothing. He couldn't be dressed shabbily. In fact, we know from a later verse that he was never sad in the king's presence. He never could go, woe is me, woe is me. What's that animal in, what? See, he knows it back there. He got it. What is it again? The donkey. Eeyore. The donkey. And he's always going, woe is me. It's just terrible. And so he couldn't even be sad. He had to be bright and chirpy and cheerful and lift up his eyes. And God had to get his attention. And he came to him, and it was like a ton of bricks, that proverbial ton of bricks that landed on him. And he began to pray. He began to talk. And he said, dear God, let's do something. Look over in chapter 4. Now we're going to do a word study here. We're going to stop in time. Good night. It's later than 7 minutes before. It's 20 to 12. Man. All right. Look in chapter 4. In chapter 4, it came to pass that this guy named Sanballat heard that we built a wall. He was fit to be tied. That's the word. And he took great indignation and he mocked the Jews. You know, when people can't say anything bad against you, they will mock you. They will try to point out that you're something that you really are not, you know. They'll mock you and use words like that. And so he spake before his brethren, the army of Samaria, and said, what are these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heap of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah, the Ammonite, was by him. And he said, wow, even if they build, a fox goes up and will break it down, their stone wall. Here we find that God got Nehemiah's attention again. He got it not only from the destruction of Jerusalem, but he got it from criticism. Now, how do you respond to criticism? Down through here, you read on and find that Nehemiah prayed, spent time in prayer. It was a call for him to pray, encouragement to pray. Now, this guy Tobiah wasn't too smart, because look at the last phrase in verse 3. He said, he shall even break down their stone wall. A fox would go break down their stone wall. It wasn't their wall, it was God's wall. He couldn't recognize that, didn't even know that. And then in the next verse, down in, where is it? I'm sorry, I can't find it here. Hang on, we'll get there. We'll get there in just a minute. In verse number 7, they heard these things. Verse 8, they conspired. Verse 9, we made our prayer. We made our prayer. So when criticism came, he responded with prayer. Now, we can get ahead of ourselves right here, and you'll find that he prayed down the wrath of God on them. He prayed for their destruction. He prayed for their removal. And people say we ought not pray like that today. And I'm not sure about that. When our son spent a year in Iraq in the heaviest of fighting in Fallujah, he was with the 82nd Airborne. We prayed heavily for his safety and for their victory. Now, when you're praying for your army's victory, you're praying for the enemy's what? Defeat. Right. And what's war designed for? To break things and kill people. Right. That's the reason you have wars, to break things and kill people. And so when you're praying to protect our son, keep that chopper up, keep that plane going, make that chute open up, and then he spent a year in Afghanistan. And they were tricksters and sneaky people. And so when you're praying for victory, you're praying for somebody to die. Now, I'm not advocating that we ought to all go out and pray down vengeance and fire on heaven. Jesus rebuked his disciples when they did that. So, but I do think that there's a place and there's a time when reprobate people, as Paul said, need to be turned over to the Lord for what did he say? Their destruction. Their destruction. Now, notice in the next verse, in verse number 10, Judah, this is one of the brethren, one of the saved men. Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish. While we can't build, you have to be careful of garbage collectors in your church. You have to be careful of people who know where all the rubbish is. Have you heard? You know who I saw the other day? Do you know what they were doing, what they were buying? My response is always, what did you say to them? Oh, I didn't want to embarrass them. Why are you telling me? Don't tell me. You either be a part of the solution or just get out of the way. And be careful of trash collectors. Judah was a trash collector, and it follows up again. Nehemiah prayed, 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 prayed. So sometimes God has to get our attention. Don't allow the circumstance to grab my attention. Now, I'm speaking to me. I'm not speaking to anybody in here. I'm speaking to me right here. Don't allow the circumstance. Don't allow the circumstance to overwhelm, upset. Don't allow it to just constrain you or lose your focus. When I saw the cows out down there this morning, I just took a deep breath and calmed down. I said, Lord, I don't know what you're going to do with them, but I got to be somewhere at 10 o'clock this morning. And they went back in, and everything's all good and fine. Never got upset, just smooth sailing. I have to speak to myself like that.
That's right.
Because I'm prone. I'm prone to flash out.
That's right.
And so, when God gets your attention, let's spend time in prayer. Now, let's go back to chapter 1. Where is that? Still back over there where it was. Yes, look in chapter 1. And notice, if you will, in chapter 1 and verse number 5, Nehemiah says, And I beseech thee, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keeps covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe the commandments. Now, here's another parenthesis here in verse 5. I said, O Lord. You know what the word there is, don't you? What is the word there? The original word.
Jehovah.
Jehovah. That's the reason some brethren don't come here, because we say Jehovah and they say Yahweh. You know that? Really? They're scholarly. They say Yahweh. And I did a paper recently upon why we've moved to, why some people have moved to Yahweh and why I still say Jehovah. It's some good scholarly reasons for that. But nobody wants to listen to me, so that's okay. Well, here it is in verse 5. He prayed these things. In verse number 5, what's the lesson here about prayer? And I find that prayer is the privilege of God's people. It's the privilege of God's people because in verse number 5, he says, he calls him the God of heaven, the great and terrible God. He's the God that keeps his promises, his covenant, and his mercy for who? For those that love him. For those that walk according to his commandments. And so prayer is for not only God's people, but God's people who are walking in fellowship with him. God's people who are walking in fellowship with him. A daily, day by day walk with the Lord. Years ago, when I was still wet behind the ears and not from showering, a lot of debates on, does God hear the prayers of the unsaved? And I heard a lot of good debates and entered in on some of them. But you know what I've concluded? Who am I to tell God what he can and cannot hear? Who am I to tell God that he can't hear the prayer of an unsaved person? I mean, if he cannot hear them, then he's limited in his knowledge, isn't he? Then he's not omniscient. Well, right, see? Now, here's the difference. He's not obligated to answer the prayer of the unsaved. But he is obligated not because of us, but because of his word. He has obligated himself to answer the prayer of God's people. See? When I was in Bible college, I lived within walking distance of school and walked it every morning. And many a day, I'd invite some of the classmates to go home with me for lunch. And we'd zip down the street, and my wife wouldn't know this, and she was so good to put another extra cup of water in the soup, or take that sandwich and cut it into 3s instead of 2s. And many times we've had visitors come in the home, And neighborhood's kids. I was out grilling one time. We must have bought pork chops for 10 cents a pound, but I was grilling some pork chops, and the neighborhood came over. He smelled it. We fixed him a plate, set him down, and fed him. Now, she didn't have to feed those people. In fact, she didn't have to feed me, but she did it out of obligation and love to me. But she was under no obligation to my classmates or the neighborhood kids. She could have said, sorry, AC, you're going to have to tell them to leave. I'm not feeding them today. I'm just totally wore out, not feeding them. She never said that. She was always gracious enough to feed them. And she fed them well. But she wasn't obligated. God's not obligated to hear the prayers. And sometimes you'll hear unsaved people give God the credit for answering their prayer. And we have to smile when we say, well, He is a God of mercy and grace. Would you like to know more about this God of mercy and grace? Don't get in a fight with Him. Don't get in an argument. Well, you're not a Christian. It just happened. It's just a coincidence. One scholarly brother said that he was accused of praying, and he said, it all happens by coincidence anyway. And this brother said, well, I found that the more I pray, the more coincidences happen. Well, here we find, though, that prayer is particular for the obedient child of God who's walking with the Lord. And so it's incumbent upon us, as we get out of bed in the morning, don't get on that smartphone and Instagram or send a text message or tweet, twatter, whatever you do. Talk to the Lord. Talk to the Lord. And God's way ahead of all this social media stuff. I mean, even Moses had a voice from God and he wrote it on a tablet. Right? So, God's ahead of all this stuff. So talk to the Lord and spend our day walking with the Lord. When the Bible says pray without ceasing, it is not stay in an attitude of prayer without ceasing. It is pray without ceasing. It means the day should never stop in prayer. And God sometimes sends along triggers of prayer. That's what I call them. Things that trigger your mind. And I see certain things and I'm reminded to pray for Brother Calvin. And other things, I pray for Brother Melvin and Brother Lord, all of you, everybody in here. I call you out by name. And I'm reminded. And I see something, read something in the newspaper that happened in Christiansburg. And I say, I have some good friends up there. And I throw up a prayer for Brother Mike and others, Russell Gordon over at Radford. And these triggers of prayer. And all day long, Brother Joe Falls was mentioned a while ago. Brother Joe Falls told me he mowed the church's grass. He wouldn't let anybody else do it. And he had the finest, nicest John Deere lawnmower that money could buy. And he had grass. How big was it, Brother Lloyd? 3 acres that he mowed, maybe? Probably more than that. 5 acres, maybe? I mean, it'd been better to get some cows or something like that. But he'd know them. And I talked to him about that. Can't you get anybody else to do that? And he said, I don't want to. He said, you know how much praying and sermon preparation I get riding that lawnmower? And you know what? It takes me 3 hours to mow what we mow. And you can pray around the world. 3 hours, do a lot of prayer. Don't stay in an attitude of prayer. Pray. Triggers of prayer. And it's a privilege of God's people. And praying will help you to walk with the Lord. I'm going to do one more here. I've got a whole bunch here. I'm going to do one more. We're out of time. Notice, if you will, in verses 6 and 7. He said, let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before thee now day and night, for the children of Israel, thy servants. And notice this. He says, I'm confessing the sins of the children of Israel. Well, that's good, isn't it? Man, I got this wicked church, Lord. You got to get them fixed. You got to get rid of their sins. Well, just read the next phrase, which we have sinned. He identifies himself. He identified himself with them. And he said, not only me, but my Father's house have sinned. Verse 7, we've dealt corruptly. We've not kept your commandments or even the statutes or even the judgments that you gave Moses. What's he doing? He's confessing. He's confessing his sins and removing the obstacles to prayer. The obstacles of prayer need to be removed. Now, there are a lot of obstacles as you go through this when you see the prayers. Let's just look at one. Can we go over to chapter 13? Look at chapter 13 and come on down to verse number 22. Here's an obstacle in chapter 13 and verse 22. You go to verse number 19 of chapter 13. When the gates of Jerusalem, when it was dark, before the Sabbath, I shut the gates and all this. And why do you do that? Because they were bringing stuff in and selling on the Sabbath day. And in verse 30, the merchants and sellers of all kind of work, they stayed right outside the gate. What does that mean? That meant the people on the inside could slip through the gate and buy even on the Sabbath day. So it wasn't enough for them to get out. In verse 21, I preached, I testified against them, and I said, why are you lodging? Why are you staying here at the wall? If you do this again, I'm going to lay hands on you. From that time forth, they didn't come anymore on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and they should come and keep the gates and sanctify. So what was going on? They were violating the Sabbath day, and he had them cleansed. And the whole book of Nehemiah, again and again, one thing would pop up, then another thing would pop up. And he spoke pretty sharply to them. He said, I'm going to lay hands on them. In fact, in another place, what did he do? You tell me what he did.
Pull the hair.
He pulled their hair out. He grabbed the whole and pulled their hair out. Now you say, you think we can do that today? Well,
Like to.
are you like Nehemiah? Do you first of all live in the king's courtyard? You have the authority of the king. Secondly, you have a letter from the king giving you a clear passage on whatever you do and telling everybody to support you, pay for the lumber, pay for the labor, pay for that, pay for the food. Do you have that? Number three, do you have a good godly heritage that people know that this is coming from God? It's just not out of an empty heart. See, so all those things have to go together. And if you can answer all of those, the first one we stop at. But if you can answer all of those, go ahead and pull hair. That's what I say. That's biblical. Pull hair. But Nehemiah got rid of the obstacles, and he was clear to do that. Sometimes in our churches, you cannot get rid of the obstacle that you see because the people are content to live with that obstacle. Why don't you do that? You preach it, but why don't you do it? Well, then you got to weigh the option. Do I split the church 9 different ways? Or do I just keep on preaching and let God handle it? Sometimes you can't handle it. 100 years ago when I went to Montville, the church was so divided they couldn't even call a pastor. And so I agreed to go there as an interim, and an interim could get voted in on simple majority. So I agreed to go there on an interim, and work with Brother Elmer Yates. He started Montville Baptist, and I was willing to work with him on that. And then shortly after we got there, he died and left me by myself. And but it was divided over hyper-Calvinism. And there was a man in the church who was a strong leader, who was a strong hyper-Calvinist, and he would pass out books in the church. And so I was just an interim, and you know what the word interim means? You look it up in the dictionary. You know what the word interim means? It means in the meantime. And sometimes it is. And so I would just kind of quietly try to shuffle it along. And then he got upset, and he started designating his offerings. He'd put the offering in the church and designate it to another church member. They'd go through the church, he got the tax deduction, and the offering went to all the church members. And I can remember a meeting coming up when we had business meetings, a meeting coming up, and I knew 100%, I was sure that the church was going to split. And the few people who were there would be less than a few people. And I just knew, as I got up and did what I had to do, it was going to split. And I can take you to the spot on the Hardy Road. So I'd ride back. I can take you to the very spot over 30 years ago. I was praying, and it was as if God spoke from heaven. It was as if a voice was there. I know it wasn't, but I still don't know that it wasn't.
That's right.
It's my church. If I want to split it, I'll split it. You just do what's right. I went on to church that night in very low key, calmly, just kind of led the church, and somebody else spoke up, and somebody else spoke up, and did the right thing. It wasn't long after that I had to tell that fella he couldn't designate his offering anymore because it's illegal.
That's right.
You can't designate, even to missionaries. You can't give anything designated to a church. It goes to the church, and the church has to spend it. Now, you can give it to the missions offering, but you can't give it to Billy Bob, the missionary. It's illegal. And he chomped at the bit, and he did that. And then one Sunday morning, as he was in a particularly grumbly mood, I kind of got him aside, and I said, I need to ask you a question. I said, how can you be a good Mason and be a good Christian at the same time? And he said, it ain't none of your business. And he never came back. And God took care of it. Sometimes you can't do what you want to do, and you have to let God lead you to get it done. And it's not in my time, it's in His time. Hey, there's a whole lot of good things on this prayer. There's about 4 or 5 good sermons in that first chapter there, and I encourage you to read on that. Go on over and read the times that he says, remember me, O God. Remember me, O God. In fact, the last verse in Nehemiah is 13:31. Now you read that backwards, it's what? 13:31. It's just like radar. You spell radar either way because it gets you coming and going. And either way, that verse is, remember me. Remember me. Oh God, remember me. Remember me, oh God. And that's the prayer of the saint Nehemiah. May God help us to be prayer warriors. Bless your word today. Bless these your people for Jesus' sake.
Amen.